Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming bright and early. It's a real pleasure for me to have a chance to share a little bit about my thoughts regarding the topic. I'm going to pivot a little bit. What I really want to focus on is leadership and how leadership has changed and what we need to be thinking about school leadership going forward. However, by doing this, I think what we can start to do is present a model for thinking through what is worth keeping. So I'm not going to go through a list of innovations of things that we should keep and what we should toss out, but I think we can come to a model of thinking about leadership and thinking about the schools that we want for the future that can give us a kind of rubric for helping us to assess what we might keep and what we might throw away and what we might adapt in the future. So this is kind of the logic of my presentation. As has been mentioned already today, we've gone through a couple years of great challenge. Societies around the world, school systems, schools have had to adapt and change very, very quickly. This, I believe, has put quite a lot of pressure on school leaders. And when I say school leaders, this is leadership writ large. We have principals, we have middle leaders, we have teacher leaders, all who have to bear the brunt, I believe. Of course, teachers do as well, but there's a lot of leadership issues that have had to be resolved without a clear roadmap for the future. We don't know what's coming next, yet we still have responsibilities. So the next stage, I think, as we're coming through COVID and as we're starting to get into a new kind of normal, is to think about what does this mean for the schools of our future? What kinds of schools are we going to imagine down the road? And I think to do this, we need to look back at where we've come from, what we know about leadership and learning over the last 20 years, where we have just been through COVID, and then what's coming next. Looking back and looking forward. So we can ask ourselves, what do we want our schools to be like, and what does this mean for school leadership? And so that brings us to these three simple questions. What do we throw away? What should we reframe or rework or adapt? And what should we keep? So this is kind of the model that I'm wanting to present. I think we can start as leaders in education to think about the future. Can we envision the sorts of schools that we want over the next few years that might be different from what we had before? And I'll come back to that as we go. I think as school leaders, to help make this come about, we can think about certain core leadership practices that we know to be effective. We can think about some emerging leadership practices that have come out and been exposed through the experience of COVID. And then we can think about what does this mean for future-oriented leadership practices? By looking back, looking at our recent experiences, does this lead to a kind of hybrid of leadership practices that we can look forward to and work on? And so I'm going to express these as three major ideas: vision agility, leadership density, and equity mindsets. And then as leaders then, part of what we are doing is we are leading for organizational renewal and organizational change. And so that shift to me is something that I'm calling whole school resilience. And to me, it's made up of three concepts that parallel the leadership concepts in some way: hybrid adaptation, holistic development, and ethically pervasive. And I'll explain these as we go. And I think this is the pathway to get us to the schools that we want. And of course, there could be other practices, there could be other features of whole school resilience, but these are the ones that resonate with me, and maybe you have other ideas as well. So thinking about the schools that we want, I realize this is a very bright slide, isn't it? Hopefully you're not blinded. But I've just put up what I think are almost like motherhood statements. But I think these are issues that we've really seen through COVID are more and more important. Schools where no one is disadvantaged because of their circumstances. We know through the COVID experiences that there's huge variation across societies, within societies, across schools in societies, and even within schools in terms of the availability and access to resources that different students have to facilitate their learning. When we have parents who are suddenly unemployed, or who have 2 kids and 2 adults, all of who need access to a computer at the same time to work and do lessons. This has had impact on equity in some regard, and there's other issues like that. We need to be thinking about different pathways to learning, and we've had to be experimenting with this through COVID. So what does this mean for the future? Are there hybridities that might emerge? We know that organizations, whether they're schools or businesses that have come through COVID well, have had to be very agile. They've had to pivot and turn often on short notice, and I'm sure you've experienced that too. I'm sure these are things that are going to continue for the future. So let's start to look back a little bit at leadership, and I'm going to start to build towards what I think leadership is going to be looking like as we move along and what that will mean for schools. So we know from research over the last 20 years that there's a certain distillation of core leadership practices. We know that leaders exert influence and influence student learning indirectly through working on teacher motivation, teacher commitment, building capacity, working on working conditions. We know that that leadership is future-oriented, working on capacity building, developing the organization. We also know that leadership looks different in school to school. Adept leaders realize that we just can't import things from another place and do it exactly the same way and expect the same success. We have to take our context into account. And 2 areas where leadership really seems to make a difference is if we're able to distribute leadership. That's different from delegation. It has to do with how do we work together with our colleagues on leadership activities and to cultivate the interactions that lead to organizational growth. And then last, we know there's certain personal resources that differentiate effective leaders from ones who tend not to be so effective. And one of the key ones is open-mindedness, being receptive to new ideas and critique and criticism even, and being able to adjust and improve on that basis. This is another simple model of thinking about leadership as having an indirect influence. And you'll notice in the center some of those things that were on the first slide. Capacity building, motivation and commitment, working conditions. So the theory being principles can influence student learning indirectly by working on those areas that lead to change practice. I think one of the things we can ask ourselves is, has our experience of COVID changed those cores? Do we need to think about capacity building differently than before? Are people motivated differently? Are our working conditions different? And do we need to address those issues differently than before? And then my last slide on leadership of the past is we know that leaders work to help colleagues through the change process. And this very simple graphic has been around for a long time, but it simply says that as we encounter change, we have a loss of capacity because we have to learn new things. We need new skills. We have to adapt. We have to change. That's all very, very challenging. Our impact on learning will actually dip and possibly get worse for a while before we learn the capacities we need and start to improve and reach our target. So this is called the implementation dip, and the work of leaders is to try to reduce the time and help people through that dip. And sorry, I thought, Okay, I tried to put a little note, oh, there it is. So how have we addressed the dip during COVID? That was my question. So does this look different than before? So I want to shift now to thinking a little bit about then how leadership has maybe shifted slightly during COVID. And I think what we found from what I've been reading and from my discussions with other school leaders and my own experience is that we see that we have to navigate leadership through a series of tensions. And Ellen Walker and I wrote a short article on this, and we're calling this Emerging Leadership Practices coming through COVID. And I'm just going, you could probably imagine what most of these are, but I'm just going to touch on a couple that I think are important for my point. And so one is the notion of promoting innovation and seeking consistency. We've had to innovate very, very quickly. We've had to learn new skills. We've had to, for instance, going rapidly to online learning while still finding new strategies to care for people's well-being. This has required really quick change. At the same time, as organizations, we need some consistency. If everyone across our organization is introducing different innovations for different purposes and we lose coherence, we are going to be challenged when it comes to meeting our mission and our goals for students as we get more and more diluted in our energies. Another is caring for people and maintaining standards. So we know through COVID that we need to work more on things like supporting people's physical, emotional, social, psychological well-being. At the same time, we have stakeholders, we have students, we have parents who are paying money, we're being paid to deliver a certain quality of product. So these aren't necessarily in direct contradiction, but we need to have an eye on both of these things. How do we make sure people don't feel too stressed and burnt out, while at the same time delivering a quality product in a different way? And this is something we have to manage. And the last point is spreading decisions while making decisions. So we know that agile and innovative organizations are able to respond quickly to what's going on if we empower people across our organizations to make decisions that are relevant to what's happening on the ground. At the same time, as leaders, we sometimes need to make decisions quickly for the organization without having the time to consult, because things are happening quickly in the environment. So again, this is not necessarily a contradiction, but I do believe it is sometimes a tension. On the one hand, having to spread around the decision-making opportunity. At the same time, quickly making decisions when they need to be done fast. And this is an interesting slide, I thought, from a survey on international schools well-being. And the reason why I'm putting it up is it made me think a little bit about, well, how are we doing with all of this leadership for well-being stuff, right? And maybe you've seen this before, but this was a survey done by Helen Kelly earlier in the year. And on the far left, I thought this was an interesting point. It's telling us, when teachers are asked, do you feel supported by leaders in your school for well-being? We're actually not coming off too well, I suppose, below 30%, you know? And we have an interesting ranger from 22% for senior leaders, 29% for middle leaders, 24% for counselors. Now this is teachers' perceptions, right? And it's perceptions. It may or may not be the truth. But we also know when you ask leaders, do they think their teachers are being well supported? Those numbers end up being much higher. So there's some kind of a different perception going on. But what's also interesting is the top number, 59%. Teachers believe they're being well supported by colleagues. So this goes to this point of having to have a whole school perspective, I believe, on well-being, but also on other issues, and developing capacity to deliver on that across our whole leadership structures. I'm going to zip along because of time. So this gets to now the core of what I want to really talk about, which is if we're thinking about leadership moving forward, what might it look like? What are sort of the key features that seem to be emerging? And what might this mean for schools as organizations? So I'm putting these two ideas together as one concept. I think we can't only think about being agile and only think about vision. We need to think about vision agility, which is the notion to me that leaders need to be very clear about the mission and focus of the school and communicate this clearly, and at the same time realize that we need to be adaptable, and while not changing our mission, we might need to change very quickly the pathways that we take to realize the mission. And why is this important? It's important for a number of reasons. First, the future's unpredictable. We don't know what's going to happen next. We don't know how we might have to deliver education in the future. All of the experience of the last 2 years have told us this. None of this was anything we expected, yet we've gone through it. To do this, we need a vision for schools of the future. What are the schools that we need and want? And this is important because when we face crises, I think all of us need a sense of purpose. What is it that motivates us and gets us through crisis? Having a clear vision and a clear focus for our energies becomes important. It's important for things like creativity and seeding innovation, because if we are not clear about what our key and top priorities are, it forces people into diluting their energies and maybe being creative in areas that do not necessarily help us accomplish the school mission and vision. So having a North Star helps us to conserve our energies and focus them. So what does this look like in an organization? I think if you were to go into a school or a business to try to get the pulse of what's going on, you would find everyone understands what the top priorities of the school are. So schools might have lots of priorities, but there are probably some that are more core than others. And there are probably some that differentiate your school from other schools. Everyone in the school should know what those priorities are. They should be the basis for discussion and conversation. And they would be also the basis for establishing a certain type of school culture, one where there's heavy collaboration, where creativity is valued, and this is important to seed bottom-up innovation. So this is I like to watch these YouTube videos called the Shark Tank. Do you know that one? Right? And so this was one that I saw the other day, and I thought makes the point well. Two entrepreneurs whose vision was to get black truffle into the hands of diners. And they would do this by sourcing this black truffle from an original provider, so they knew the quality of the sound, and then they would sell it to restaurants. Well, when COVID happened in their area, the entire restaurant chains were shut down. They had 20 kilos of black truffle on hand and needed to figure out what to do with it, or else they would lose thousands of dollars. So within 7 days, what they did is they said, okay, we'll forget about the restaurants. Instead, what we'll do is we'll direct market it through social media, but we'll do it in a way where we provide recipes, all of the ingredients boxed, and instructional videos and live coaching through the internet so people could make this at home. They sold all their supply within 7 days, didn't lose a thing. And my point is, though, they still had the same vision. It's getting black truffle into the hands of diners, but they found a different, more agile way to do it, and now their whole business model has changed. I'll have other examples for education later, but my second area was leadership density. And so This builds on the notion of leaders focusing on capacity building and that notion of spreading decisions while making decisions. I think we know more and more now that the organizations and the schools of the future build leaders across schools. So it's not just the principals and people who have formal leadership positions that have leadership responsibilities. And we need capable leaders at all levels. And why do we need them? We need them for a few reasons. One is because we don't know what the future is going to be like, and because we don't know where sources of good ideas are going to be found, we need people who know the school vision and mission and are able to scan the horizon looking for possibilities that they bring back into the school. That to me is a leadership activity, whether you are a principal or a classroom teacher. This too creates for the possibility of bottom-up innovation. If we have people across our schools who have the opportunity, say, I've seen one example in schools where inquiry projects were very important for school staff. Staff have the opportunity to identify areas of innovation that interest them, study it in depth, share what they've learned with colleagues. This to me is an interesting model. Even though you might not have a formal leadership position, that to me is a leadership activity that serves to enhance the capacity of other people in your organization, which leads to improved student outcomes. And the second area, or another area for why this is important, is responsive communication. For organizations to be agile, it's not enough for parents to be writing letters to the principal to say, this is an issue I'm facing, what are you going to do about it? We need all of our school staff to have ears open and eyes open, to be listening and looking for issues and concerns that affect our stakeholders and bring that back to the organization. So taking the pulse of what's going on in the community. So what does this look like? I think there's a few things. One is we have diverse pathways for exercising leadership. So this might be opportunities or opportunities for interactions around leadership activities. It might mean working collaboratively together. It might entail a coordinated sort of working together, where we know that certain leaders will do certain things at certain times. Pervasive opportunity to lead. So I use that inquiry example. If we're going to build leadership capacity, we need to give people the opportunity to act as leaders, whether or not they have formal roles. That's how we can identify potential. And we need to think about organizational designs, educational infrastructure that supports capacity development. So it's not enough just to know we have heads of departments or grade level leaders. We need to be thinking about how do we structure their work so that we get the types of interactions across our organization that facilitate growth. So here's an example from a US school system where they were looking at it was out of school summer programs. And how do you deliver these things that might have involved outdoor education, for example? And so what they did is they looked at, we need to think about our organizational infrastructure in a few different areas: academic support, technological support, and operational support. And what they did is they prioritized certain routines that would lead to collaborative discussion. And so even though this was largely occurring online, they facilitated certain activities like giving rich feedback to planning. They developed new tools and new roles for people, and they really looked at adjusting the information flow. So it wasn't enough just to have top-down communication. How do you also have bottom-up communication and communication across the organization. I'm going to push on. My third area was equity mindset. And what is that? And I think this is an issue that we hear a lot about now in discussion. That and you'll hear other people talking about that in the next day or two. And it's the issue that it's not enough to think about equality in outcomes. We need to recognize that there are differentials in opportunity for learners, but also for families and members of our community. And we as leaders need to think proactively about how do we balance the scales to provide opportunity for everyone in our organization, in our school. And that might mean some people getting more resources to balance the scales, right? And this also might mean we need to think about the diversity that we have within our schools. How can we know and understand and get a rich sense of the needs of our organization if we don't have diversity within our schools in order to get the pulse and feedback from different viewpoints? So this is why it's important, I believe. An equity mindset can help us get a richer sense of the diversity that impacts on our organizations. This influences our growth and the health of our organizations as we understand issues from different perspectives. This, I think, can help us with getting locked in to certain viewpoints and getting tunnel vision. And moreover, I think it helps us with being better connected to our communities. Oftentimes I notice in international schools, a huge resource that we have for understanding our communities better is often with our language teachers, who often are our local people. And they have a good pulse on the community and the needs of the community writ large. And sometimes we can take better advantage of those sorts of resources in our schools. So what does it look like if you're in a school where there's strong equity mindsets? I think we see that there's active engagement in trying to understand, is there inequity in our organization? And what do we do about it if that's the case? We look at differentiating support. We realize that not only is it that learners might have different needs, maybe our staff are also at different developmental stages and need different kinds of support as well. Hi, Max. We look at being engaged with our communities. So more and more, I think, in the past we've always thought of being learner-centered schools. I think we need to broaden that a bit to being community-centered schools. Why? Because we have community members who provide rich resources to support our teaching and learning agendas. They can help us understand the needs of our students and families better. So being more and more community engaged. So this is a school, as by way of example, a local school here in Hong Kong, where they've taken a strong stance on equity. It's a diverse school full of different minority groups, South Asians, lower SES, mainland Chinese. And the principal, Lee Kin Man, has taken the stance that more opportunities to learn means more ways to show success. So it's not just about examination success. We need different pathways for our students from different backgrounds with different needs to demonstrate their learning potential. He's got his own vision, which you see in the 3 circles. And what I find most inspiring is the notion of focusing on soulware, community, and impact. And everything that the school does is about trying to accomplish that. And so we see, I've given examples of actually changing the physical structure of the school, creating unique and original spaces to allow for that diversity. So I'm going to wind up in just the next few slides. What does this mean then for schools? So leaders, in my view, help to shape the direction of schools and help to put in the structures that develop schools. But to do that, we also need to have that vision of what our schools should be like. What are the schools that we need and the schools we want? And so this is my next model that helps me at least to conceptualize this. And so I'm calling it whole school resilience. And so this is really just the ability, the capacity of schools to respond to changes in the general context, to maintain adaptability, but also to do it in a way that builds capacity. So that's that developmental aspect, but for all. So that's that equity aspect. And this is, I think, what leaders can work on through their vision agility, leadership density, and equity mindset. And I believe this can also be used as a filter to help us think through what to keep, adapt, or discard. So this is how I think, this is my model here of whole school resilience, having 3 dimensions: hybridity, development, and ethics. And in the brackets, these, I believe, are the leadership practices that help us to enact this. And so hybridity is this ability to recombine old and new strengths. There's good practices of the past, and there's new things that we've learned. How do we adapt that and put them together so a new strength emerges that will help us reach the schools that we need? Development, again, enhancing capacity for all and building the networks within schools and beyond schools that we need for developmental purposes. And ethics. This has to do with protecting the diversity in our school for all the reasons that I've mentioned before. Diversity leads to and enhances our capacity, so they're all interrelated. But with that is thinking about how do we distribute resources equitably, and how do we renew energy? Energy is a limited supply, and we've been burning a lot of it the last 2 years. How do we if we're thinking about the schools we want for the future and what we need and what we want to conserve and what we want to throw away, energy has something to do with this too. So if we're thinking about Innovation X and we're asking what do we add, eliminate, recombine, or adapt, I think we can think about hybridity, development, and ethics in light of the schools that we want, and use that as kind of a rubric to help us assess what do we keep, what do we not keep. So to wind up, coming back to my original model, what I've tried to discuss today is this notion that we're at a point now, having a set of old practices, some recent emerging practices, where we need to start thinking about what does this mean for the schools of the future. Leaders work on this through drawing on, not throwing out, but drawing on old tried and true practices, some emerging leadership practices, and then I believe that is leading us to some future-oriented practices. We draw on these practices to work on whole school resilience, which I think is a potential pathway to get us to the schools that we want. So that just leads me on to my last slide with, I think, a few challenges, particularly for international school sector. And so one of them is this. Because we're thinking now about issues like equity and issues like community involvement, and thinking of community as being maybe communities, our families, the community, the actual location, the people who in the location nearby are neighbors, but maybe also professional communities. Can our schools act as hubs for professional learning, for community service, for parental support? So it's thinking about not just being learner-centered, but being community-centered. I think international schools have potential for this, not just for the locale community, but also thinking about how do we support less privileged schools in other countries that are not as well off as Hong Kong. Can we use our networks as a means to support growth and development in these areas? And if so, what does it mean for these areas, for these leadership practices, such as vision agility, and how we reposition our delivery of essential priorities? And how do we intentionally develop leadership density in our schools for these sorts of purposes? And finally, what does an ethical mindset mean for inclusive decision-making around inequity and strategic resourcing? So just a few thoughts to leave you with, and I think I've got 3 minutes left, so I'll stop. Thanks very much for your attention.